Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going great. Yeah, I had a great weekend coaching some young athletes for Ontario Cycling. We were over at Hardwood Ski and Bike and had 2 big days of just playing bikes. We were riding a little and doing, working on skills, and yeah, it was great. Lots of laughs. Yeah. How about you? What did you get up to?
Well, I feel like I'm finally recovered from last weekend. Last weekend I got to do a talk for the Durham Shredders O Cup, talking to girls about training and racing and nutrition and all that fun stuff. But then we actually went from Wood Newton to Ottawa after having been in Fort Erie, which if anyone anyone knows Ontario geography, these 3 points make no sense as a point to point to point. But in Ottawa, Fast and Female was putting on a big conference for freshman year high school girls, along with a couple other Ottawa-based girls in sport groups, and they asked me to come in and do a workshop on crafting your narrative. So Peter's wearing his Strong Girl Publishing t-shirt today to kind of represent for that. But
check out the episode on YouTube if you want to see this t-shirt.
Yeah.
Can you order this t-shirt?
You can order this t-shirt at stronggirlpublishing.com. Thank you for that.
All things young women and sport and literacy and
it's true. Yeah.
What's it called when you know how to write? Is that a thing?
That's literacy, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I don't know if that's true.
At any rate, it was a super cool event and just had so much fun. But oh my gosh, thank God we have this podcast is really all I can say, because my ability to public speak has gotten so much better over the last few years, I think, from doing this week in, week out. But it's still, I can still definitely improve. And also it leaves me so exhausted after. So I think like physically, mentally, emotionally, I was wrecked all week.
This was quite big. And I mean, you were at TD Place, I think it's called. What did the Red Blacks, my brother was telling me, play there, maybe the football team?
Yeah, I was indoors they also have a hockey arena in there, and they covered the ice. So I was on like a black mat covering ice, which if you've ever watched Parks and Rec, you might recall the episode with Leslie Knope on the hockey arena. Anyway, that's all I could think of all day. But it was an incredible experience, super, super fun. But yeah, absolutely wrecked the whole week after. I couldn't believe, honestly, the physical toll was what really surprised me. I was just down a peg on all of my runs until pretty much Saturday, just feeling so flat, so tired.
Okay.
But we're back. Everything's great.
We're back. So this is Dr. Stephen Cheung.
Yes.
We have a great episode. This is one that we've teased a few times about heat preparation. So Stephen and I went deep on it. It's, sciencey in places. But I think you'll learn a bunch about physiology.
Let's also maybe back up and say Dr. Stephen Cheung, professor of Brock University, one of the foremost researchers when it comes to heat adaptation.
Dehydration. He's also a guinea pig. We were talking offline. It didn't get into the episode, but he actually does each study. So he has, PhD students, master students who are designing a lot of the studies now, but he'll go through. So, he'll put himself in a cold bath or a hot bath or a, exercise to volitional failure. And yeah, so that he's also a human guinea pig, but he's been doing this a long time and is a great guy, very willing to share sort of details and put up with, I tried to keep testing him on my weird hacks for heat training. And he would say, I don't know about that. So it got funny. So towards the end, we start getting into my do it yourself,
your protocols,
your masters, elite masters heat adaptation hacks. So hold on for that one. But we also go through sort of the fundamentals of heat adaptation and different sort of terms, what you're trying to accomplish doing this, who it might not be appropriate for, which I think is always a good question.
Very important.
We talk about those big rocks, and training first is probably the most important thing. But I think this is great. I think this was getting towards the episode we were hoping to create. So
cool.
Very happy with it.
All right. Well, then we should get right into it. Enjoy this episode with Dr. Stephen Cheung.
Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. I'm excited. This is a second appearance for Dr. Stephen Cheung. Welcome back.
I'm very excited to be back with you, Peter.
Okay, and we have a view of your you called it your cave, where you keep all your bikes and your climbing gear, your consummate athlete equipment. So I love this view into your athletic self.
Yeah, it's 2016, I managed to convince my wife to let me celebrate my impending 100th academic paper by kicking the cars out and turning it into kind of a cycling studio. So we got our trainers here, we got TV, big screen TV, comfy couches, got all the bikes racked up. It was my wife that came up with the awesome idea of going with the World Championship rainbow stripes color scheme. And like I say, I got all my climbing gear and workshop tools in here. So it's a nice little hideaway.
I love it. I love it. You're always inspiring, and I'm excited. I think I'll see you this weekend. We're both doing a gravel race here in Southern Ontario.
Yeah, I'm hoping to make it, but if it's really sandy, if I recall, this scrappy badger. So
Yes.
yeah, it's pretty intense.
You share my love of sand, it sounds like. Well, there you go. So you mentioned hundreds of studies, or hundred a study. I don't want to oversell here, but you did just recently have this review study come out looking at the effects of heat adaptation on physiology. So kudos on that. It was a great read. You sent it over to me, and this was from July of 2023. So I guess why don't we dive into it? Because today I really wanted to talk about heat adaptation and specifically, what can a master's age grouper draw from the research? So I'm curious to see, what's new, and then also we'll try and get it down to practical, what's relevant for the, the working class folks. So with that said, I'll ask a question. What is new in this review study if we're going to look at it, from a layperson's view?
Sure. So just a little bit of background. In 2016, my UK colleague Chris Tyler and I led a big meta-analysis of all of the heat adaptation and exercise performance and physiology studies. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with what a meta-analysis is, it's basically taking all of the existing studies, taking all of the individual data from those studies and grouping them together and doing statistics on them. So you have a much bigger sample size than your typical study of 10 participants. So that's what we did in 2016. And we had at that time about 96 papers that we gathered. And this is ranging from about the 1950s through to 2016. And so then we decided to do an update last year and thought it was fitting because, or we thought it was fitting because there's been a lot more work. There's been 39 additional studies that we put into this meta-analysis. So now we're up at over 130, about 135 studies. And there's also been more research on women. And there's been kind of more of a focus on heat adaptation, especially with the Tokyo Olympics, where that was obviously a big concern for a lot of athletes. And also, we also had the World Athletics Championships in Qatar in 2019, the Qatar World Cup 2022. So there's been a lot of interest. So it was time to already update it. And in terms of what did we find that was new? I guess first thing is, what did we find kind of to begin with in terms of the original meta-analysis? And not surprisingly, heat adaptation does work. And in general, you can get away with a heat adaptation program of as short as about a week, even 5 days or so. But it's also one of those cases that the longer you can do it, the better you can do it. And that relates to some of the massive benefits you see in a lower starting core temperature, increase in plasma volume, increase in your kind of ability to tolerate discomfort, a decrease in thirst, and also an increased sweating rate. And so all of those together allow you to perform better in the heat. So it is definitely, the conclusion definitely is that of all the things you can do to get ready for heat adaptation is by far the biggest bang for your buck. You can look at other things to do, whether on the day of drinking cold drinks, wearing an ice vest and those kind of things. Those are the final kind of 1%. Those are the band-aids if you're not heat adapted, you're still not going to perform optimally. So that was kind of some of the main conclusions we had from 2016.
Okay, maybe a couple definitions. So those techniques you mentioned right at the end there, that would you call those heat mitigation techniques, or what's the technical term for those, like the ice bath, or like putting your ice towels down your thing, or ice drinks or whatever?
Yeah, I think heat mitigation strategies would be good to call them. Again, they range everything from cooling yourself down beforehand, just immediately before, whether you are wearing an ice vest during your warm up, and a lot of cyclists, triathletes, rowers do that, or you are drinking very cold water beforehand, both for hydration purposes and to try to cool your body temperature down. You see things like the ice towels or ice collars that you put around your neck. They can also be things like that you're doing during an event, such as pouring cold water over yourself, or if certainly that's been the case for some marathons, some endurance events where athletes will be putting on a really cold, wet cap, and they'll just be repeatedly
Right.
doing that over time to try to keep themselves cool.
Now, they do work.
But
I was going to say, in your view,
yeah,
is it's very small amounts?
uh, yeah, compared to what the benefits you can get from being adapted to heat beforehand.
Okay. And then another definition that I guess I was aware of, but didn't have the definitions, I guess. But there's sort of this concept of heat adaptation strategies, which are like the saunas and stuff we'll get into. And then there's also I can never say the word, but acclimatization. So like heat acclimatization, which would be you just live in a hot place and you gradually acclimate to that. Is that the idea?
Yeah, let's go over some of the kind of terminology that you'll typically hear. The first is heat adaptation, which for scientists we use as an umbrella term for anything that, whether it's physiological, psychological, that changes in response to repeated heat exposure. So that's the big umbrella term. And then there is two kind of very similar terms. One is heat acclimation. The other is heat acclimatization. Heat acclimation refers to an artificial environment. So whether you're in my heat chamber in my lab, whether you're in a sauna, whether you're sitting in a hot tub, those kind of artificial environments. And heat acclimatization refers to if we move to the Caribbean, and if we were there at a specific heat camp where in addition to training in the heat, we're also just living naturally in the heat. So that's heat acclimation is the artificial environment. Acclimatization is the natural environment. And then there's a fourth term, which is habituation, which really refers to the psychological kind of perception of heat stress, which also reduces you're less uncomfortable in the heat after you're heat adapted. So we try to use that word habituation for more the psychological side.
Interesting. Well, where would that come up? Would that be, there'd be some sort of intervention that wouldn't have a physiological change, but that makes you, more comfortable, I guess? Would that be like, I'm trying to think like, that might be, I don't know what would be, like it would be like maybe a mental training technique even, I guess, could be something that might assist in that.
Yeah, actually, and in 2017, my master's student at the time, Phil Wallace, and I published a pretty big paper. We thought a pretty impactful paper, specifically looking at using sports psychology to improve our performance in the heat. And so what we did was we used what's called motivational skill training, and that's a way to really reframe your negative perspectives of something, of turning that into a positive framework instead. So instead of saying, oh, this heat really sucks, we had athletes trained to really reframe that. Oh, this means I'm working hard. This is good. You can do it. You can push through, that kind of idea. So what we had was we had your typical control group, which we sent them away, came back 2 weeks later and did another heat test. And then we had the motivation group where we really had this individualized sports psychology training. The interesting thing was their aerobic fitness, your typical measures of fitness didn't change at all over the 2 weeks, but the group that had the psychology training, they were able to tolerate really hard effort in the heat for much, much longer. It was a ride as long as they can at a set, really hard workload. And the group that had the motivational skills training, they were able to really go almost like 26%, I think, longer than before. Wow. Without any changes at all to their physiology, and that included kind of their heart rate, all of those measures. So it showed that, really there is that big power of the brain to really regulate our ability to exercise, and to not discount that too, whether we're just in regular training or in these extreme environments.
Okay. Now let's go to the, probably the sexiest thing here is we're talking about this heat adaptation. Maybe, do you want to, you can guide this a little bit, but should we talk about the, ideal way if I was a pro athlete and I said, Stephen, help me get ready for the Olympics in this hot place. Do you want to take me through like your ideal, progression towards that? Like, when would we start? How long would it be? The temperature? Would you do sauna or hot tub? Active, passive? Do you want to just, I don't know if that's I know it's a big question, but I'm wondering if it's easy to just say in the ideal situation, what would you do?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's actually take an example. And I had the real privilege to work with Amber Neben before the UCI World Championships in 2016, and where she ended up winning the gold medal in the women's time trial. And her coach and herself came to me with the real question of how do we get ready for her to compete in the heat. And she was based in LA. The race was in the
Emirates, right?
Late, it was in Qatar. It was in late October, early November, but it was still going to be extremely hot. And we certainly saw instances of the women's time trial, the team time trial, which was the first event up. A lot of athletes were just all over the road and just really suffering from the heat. And so we started working together about 3 months ahead of time. And so, we knew that, she was based in Southern California, which is warm, but certainly not warm, crazy hot like Qatar is. And plus it was going to be in October, so it was going to be a little bit cooler in Southern California. Right. So we knew what we were facing with. And the great thing was they came to me early. It wasn't like 2 weeks ago to go and say, like, what do we do? They came to me with about 3 months to go. And so what we ended up doing was really planning for her to be as adapted as possible, as early as possible in this 3-week block. And then just maintaining that heat adaptation over the final month or so that it really didn't disrupt her kind of key kind of final 1 month block. So this would also really apply for if we have, Ironman triathletes, for example, who are racing in Kona in November, and we're here in Canada where it's already going to be cool. So what are things that we had Amber do? Well, we had her do a really kind of heavy 2-week to 3-week block of heat adaptation early on. So that ended with about 6 weeks or so to go. And then we just had her do 1, maybe 2 kind of shorter heat doses from the remaining time onwards, from 6 weeks to race.
Like 1 to 2 per week.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So the whole purpose is we didn't want to disrupt kind of the real critical last kind of 4 to 6 weeks of training with having heat adaptation on top of it. Because remember, heat is an extra stress in your body. You're also not going to be able to work as hard. So you're not going to be able to train as hard, and it's an extra stress on you. Okay. So first advice is ideally start early. And so that you're not disrupting the really critical final phases of preparation. And then we know from the limited studies that look at the decay of heat adaptation is that once you're heat adapted, you can keep it for a pretty long time with these periodic doses. So that's good news. So again, you don't have to just keep pounding yourself with heat in the final phases. So that was the first thing we did. And then the other thing is, what are some creative DIY ways? She had access to a sauna. I think if I recall, it was either at her house or, right next to her house. So we knew we had a sauna. We knew, she obviously had lots of clothing that can be used. And so we used a combination of those modalities. We had some rides where we had her dress up as if it was in the middle of a Canadian winter, basically, even though she was in Southern California. And the idea is to really just, get her really warm, get her body temperature really high. And that was the main focus of the clothing. And then we also supplemented it with, there were days during the heat adaptation cycle where, as soon as she came home, we had her go straight into the sauna. She had a cooler with her recovery drinks and everything right, outside the sauna. So she could just grab it, bring it in with her, and she could already be, drinking her recovery drinks and getting recovered physically. But the purpose of the sauna was really to maintain that heat stimulus. It wasn't to drive her core temperature up even higher. It was, okay, she came back from the ride already hot. It was to maintain that heat stimulus for another 30 minutes or so. And that actually seems to have been really borne out by the scientific literature since that time in 2016 in terms of how best to use passive heat exposure. The best, most effective way seems to be, whether it's a hot tub, whether it's a sauna, to use it to maintain your body temperature, not necessarily to go from baseline temperature and go straight up from there.
And I've definitely found that it's much easier. I don't necessarily have core temperature, but like even just watching heart rate and perceived exertion, it seems much faster. You get into the bath and you're like, my heart rate's up, like elevated, a lot more than it would be normally laying down, like twice, say, like resting heart rate. So, and then it seems like it would just be quicker, the whole process, maybe.
For sure. Yeah. It's also really uncomfortable just raising your core temperature as high as is needed with a sauna or with a hot tub. So, which I guess is the other point that we want to talk about. The main thing you want to do with heat adaptation, what do we mean when you say, have a heat kind of a day? It's really to drive your core temperature up. Mm-hmm. And ideally, from the scientific literature, the general consensus is that you should probably raise it to above 38.5 degrees or so. Our resting temperature is, around 37. So raise it about 1.5 degrees and ideally keep it there for an hour, at least, over the course of about every day for about 2 weeks. That's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about your typical ideal heat adaptation, is about an hour a day of being, at around 38.5 degree core temperature for 10 to 14 days.
Okay. And then, so just normally riding outside in California, you wouldn't have that elevated core temperature, or like very small amount of elevated core temperature, right? If she hadn't overdressed.
Yeah, because the thing to keep in mind is that you still have a lot of airflow in when you're riding. If you're riding 30K an hour, you have 30K an hour of wind speed blowing by you, even if there's no additional headwind or anything, gotcha. Right? So you have a lot of cooling that is possible.
We spoke a lot the first time you were on the podcast, that we were talking more about trainer riding and trying to stay cooler indoors. Yep. And so we were trying to optimize the cooling, and that was a lot of our discussion, was the airflow. So I guess that makes sense here on the other side.
Yeah. So yeah, that's why the I mean, you can in certain conditions. For example, if you're on a mountain bike, doing a steep climb, yes, there's a lot less
I've
airflow, right?
yeah, I've raced in a
And
few sections called the Oven, and it was it was a great name.
yeah,
Yeah, steep and like exposed to the sun, but then no airflow because it was so steep, and like it just felt like the ground was like roasting back at you.
hmm
Yeah, yeah,
yeah. So certainly, kind of your style of cycling or endurance sports matters because again, if you're a runner, you're also going to have a lot less airflow.
yeah.
And especially if you're running uphill, right? So you can
Okay.
drive your core temperature up even on a relatively cool day, if you are going really hard uphill at a very slow speed because there's minimal cooling even on a relatively cool day.
I
So
hadn't thought
that's
of
one
that. Like,
thing.
and I guess as someone who runs and bikes and does various things, I guess that would be like the heat adaptation response isn't necessarily specific to your cycling. This is one time where the adaptation isn't. It doesn't need to be exactly the sport you're doing, right?
Yeah. I like to say that the body is pretty dumb in a way. It doesn't care how you get the body temperature up. It just wants the body temperature up to have that physical stimulus. So the body isn't going to know, oh, actually we got hot today because you were wearing clothing, and that's going to be somehow different from another day where you got hot because you were climbing very slowly on a mountain bike, going very up a very steep hill. The body is not sensitive to how you get hot. It just needs to get hot. So that's the main message.
So now, if we use this example, it doesn't have to be exactly what Amber did, but she's out riding. At the end of her ride, she puts on more clothes or something, and gets a little warm. I would imagine for like the last half hour or something, and then she does half hour in the sauna, and that's an hour. Is that sort of the rough idea?
Yeah, and that's where kind of the details start getting in. One of the questions uh, Tim and Amber had was, okay, should I be doing these heat days during my endurance rides, or what about when I am doing my high quality intervals? Should I be also doing heat kind of during those days? And my advice was to as much as possible keep the heat kind of efforts during the longer endurance rides where kind of the quantity is the quality, right? Whether you hit 150 watts versus 160 watt average doesn't really matter in a sense, right? You're just looking for a long time at that effort. So that's where we can kind of add that layer of heat. However, on those really high quality interval days, I wanted her to have the best possible physical training, right? If her target is 300 watts, I want to make sure she hits those 300 watts. I don't want her hitting 270 watts because she's hot. We need that stimulus of the 300 watts.
Hmm.
So
And the psychology, right? Like if she stops hitting 300 watts, we might lose performance.
yeah, exactly. So what we did was we had her, on those high quality interval days, do them to her best possible effort, not load up on heat or anything like that. And let's say, if she was still planning, an hour of riding afterwards, okay, after the intervals, then go and put your extra clothing on, and then kind of again start the heat adaptation that way at that time, and then again top it up with the sauna at the end. So those are the other kind of main advice I gave them. The quality work, you really want to keep high quality, and you don't necessarily want to overload it with heat. The caveat though is I did throw in, or I did suggest a couple of days where we had kind of the worst of all worlds, where it was kind of all at race pace simulation or kind of these high quality intervals in the heat, and just a few of them. And that was for the psychology,
Mm.
right? It's you can be physically super well prepared, but if you're suddenly, you're asked to do this hard effort in the heat and you've never done it before, it's still a shock. So there was just a few times where I wanted to put everything together to have her experience the entire both physical and the psychological package.
Hmm. Okay. Um, That's probably good as far as like an ideal case study. Thank you for sharing that because it actually was a bit of a case study. Um, Maybe we go from there. Do you have any experience like using this with like a serious master? Like I guess, or maybe we jump to the other side of this. Does this have any place with your normal active person, recreational cyclist? Like, do you see this having any practical application? If someone's, not necessarily, they're not getting their hour a day of exercise or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, no amount of heat training is going to overcome, poor fitness, right? So it's not like, okay, I don't do my training, I'm just going to go sit in the sauna and somehow I'm going to be well prepared for my event. That certainly doesn't happen. So, but who is it good for? I think it is good. It can be useful for almost any athlete that has a key, a grade event that they know is going to be in the heat. It's one of those things that if you know that this event is important to you and there's a high chance that it's going to be in the heat, then you should absolutely kind of prepare yourself for it. If it's that important to you, this event, then you should prepare to the best that you can. So that's both physically and kind of to be adapted to the environment. So there's certainly a use for it for almost everybody, I think. Living here in Southern Ontario, we know in the summertime, it just gets ridiculously hot and humid. So even just our normal riding, we want to enjoy those, right? So why not be prepared for it too? And especially when there's a lot of easy ways that we can kind of get adapted to heat as everyday individuals without necessarily super specialized equipment. And one of the easiest ways to do it is just to ride indoors. Our last episode was talking about riding indoors and trying to minimize the heat stress involved in there. Well, indoors is also a great way to get hot and bothered, as we all know from training in the wintertime. So that's one easy way for everyday athletes to get heat stress and to have that heat adaptation. And you can do it just in the course of your regular rides. Instead of having a fan on, have less of a fan on, or not have a fan on at all. And that's certainly going to drive your core temperature up higher than it normally would. So that's one very easy way to do it. And then again, if you do have a hot tub, if you do have a sauna, then also use that. Again, I would use that at the end rather than just sit in there and expect to get really hot, because you're going to be way too uncomfortable before you get hot enough if you're just sitting in a sauna or a hot tub. So yeah, for athletes, those are two easy ways. And then you can also replicate the wearing a lot of clothes, right? That's also going to get you hot. And again, the body is not smart enough to care how you get hot. It just needs to get hot. And in terms of can you get, if you are going to be competing, for example, in a hot and humid environment like Tokyo, can you get away with a hot and dry kind of type of adaptation? And there's only been one study that has ever really looked at adaptation of kind of different environments and can you mix and match, and that was by Barbara Griffon in 1997. And it was a really tough study to do, really elegant study. She had the exact same kind of overall wet bulb globe temperature, which is wet bulb globe temperature is trying to amalgamate all of the temperature, humidity, solar radiation, airflow, all of those into one single number. It's kind of like the Humidex. The Humidex in Canada, that's a way to kind of integrate air temperature and humidity. Wet bulb globe temperature amalgamates kind of solar radiation and airflow on top of it too. But so they had the exact same overall wet bulb globe temperature, either in a very hot and dry environment or a warm and humid environment or a really high solar radiation environment. So different types of heat stress, but they all got they all got 2 weeks of heat adaptation in these environments. And they found that all 3 groups had significantly heat adapted. And then the nice twist they had on there, they also mixed and matched the groups at the end. So the hot and dry group, then in addition to being tested pre and post hot and dry, they also got tested in a hot and humid environment. Same thing with the solar radiation group. They also got tested in a hot, dry environment. So they mixed and matched environments at the end. And what they found was that all 3 groups adapted equally well, regardless of what condition. And then even when you mixed and matched it, they responded in the same kind of heat adapted way. So that's the only existing study. It's really well done, but it's the only study. But it suggests to me again, and that's why I say the body doesn't really care how it gets hot. It just needs to get hot, and the adaptation will all happen similarly.
Mm. Yeah, it strikes me that maybe the only things you'd get with the specific ones would be things like when it's humid, you're sweating so much and it's like all in your eyes. So maybe you develop a way to like wipe your eyes, or different sunscreen. You'd find out the sunscreen is worse. So it'd be more
That's
of
my everyday anyway.
the practical
I
specific.
sweat like crazy, and it always gets in my eyes.
Well, I'm not looking forward to going bald. I don't know how people handle that, but that's another story. So let me tell you here. So as an elite master, I'll classify myself as this. Getting ready more towards July, and I have an eye towards that. And then the weather was really bad in April here in Ontario, which I don't know why I didn't expect this. It always is. So what I was doing was, if I could ride outside, I'd do your overdressing towards the end. And I did a bit of indoor riding where I'd ride for maybe an hour and then overdress for 30 or 60 minutes to finish it. And then I started adding the passive in just the bath as well to finish those off. And I found I got bored in like 20 minutes a lot of times. So I can get like 25. And now I'm getting, and I think, is it bored or is it getting like agonizing and I just want to get out? So the most recent one, I got about 30 minutes. And I've been saying like the every day as a master, I think is very tough, right? Like there's some days I can do it. So I'd say over the last 3 weeks, I've probably got maybe 10 of those sessions, which isn't, that's maybe half the days, right? So call it every other, but some would be back to back. And I would say that heart rate wise, I've been tracking heart rate and I've noticed that's sort of improved. And then because I've been in the bath, the interesting thing is I get like orthostatic hypertension standing up where I'm like, whoa, okay. Which I assume is, the blood has gone to the periphery and then you stand up and that's a challenge. So I think that's gotten better in the last couple sessions as well. So given that brief description, what do you think? Would you change anything? Is the gap, not doing it every day, is that going to be an issue? What do you think?
I guess first off, the important thing we might want to talk about is how can we as everyday athletes monitor kind of, are we actually heat adapted, or are we kind of heat stressed enough on a day-to-day basis? And there's probably the best way is by monitoring our heart rate. Heart rate is one of the 4 kind of real classic signs of heat adaptation, along with a lower core temperature, along with improved performance, and also an increased sweat rate. So those are kind of the 4 pillars. And of those, probably the easiest ones to monitor is heart rate, because most of us have a heart rate monitor. Another relatively easy way to monitor is our sweat rate. And, we can pretty much tell if we're sweating a lot more, and both kind of during our rides and just monitoring our weight before and after a typical ride, right? So those are ways that we can monitor those pretty easily. If we see over time a lower heart rate, then at rest, and also during kind of fairly mild exercise, then that's also a good sign that we're heat adapted. So there's no real easy way to non-invasively measure kind of core temperature. The kind of in the mouth thermometers It's it's pretty challenging to use. The tympanic temperatures, the ones used to see if your kids have a fever, they are horrible. Don't use those. Same with kind of the during COVID, we had those heat guns.
Right.
Those are also highly inaccurate. And I'm already not under Christmas list, but the we've seen all the pros using that kind of core body temperature monitoring system, and I've been kind of given one to use since they started in 2020, and the company was really bullish on me kind of promoting it, but I just haven't seen any science that shows it to be accurate. So they've shown it to be reliable, but they haven't shown it to be accurate in terms of, is my core temperature actually 38.5 or not? It will tell me every day it's 38.5, but is it actually 38.5?
Well, and it
So
strikes me like if I'm sitting, in a hot tub or a bath, then it's not super useful because it's going to get heated to the water temperature, right?
yeah, yeah. So that's also another thing. So yeah, I know the company is making a massive marketing push. They have a ton of world tour cycling teams using it, but honestly, of all of the science that I have seen, I have yet to find one that supports their claim of accuracy.
Yeah.
So I'm very hesitant to say, oh yeah, just go and use that to measure core temperature. I think, how do you know that you're hot enough, whether you're on a trainer or whatever? You should be really sweating profusely. You should know that you are, really, having those sweat pouring into your eyes kind of thing. That's when you know you're kind of hot enough. And just your perceived effort should be kind of harder than, if you're normally used to riding an endurance effort at 150 watts, it should feel harder,
Mm.
like when you are sufficiently hot.
And maybe the drift, like I think most people would see a fair
Yep.
bit of decoupling or drift. Like I would rarely see that until like, it got very hot outside or I was going, hard or something. But like on those trainer sessions, it was like significant. I would see, over 30 to 60 minutes.
Yep. Absolutely.
The
So yeah, you would see some of the cardiac drift, which leads to another kind of thing people often ask is, should I, if my point is to drive core temperature up, should I not drink during my heat rides? And n- I would say just keep with your normal hydration plan and let kind of your effort do kind of drive your core temperature up. Back in the mid 2000s, the first decade, there were a few papers that suggested that it might be possible to get kind of the best of all worlds to by dehydrating yourself at the same time as heat adapting, you're going to give a bigger overall stress and stimulus, and you can accelerate kind of the adaptation. The last while, the studies that have tried to replicate those early studies haven't really seemed to show the same benefits. So I would suggest no, just keep with your normal hydration, because you're not just training for the heat adaptation, you're also training with an eye to recovering so that you can train the next day also, right?
Yeah.
So if you end up one day really behind the eight ball in hydration and then you show up the next day dehydrated, it's just going to be a cumulative
And
effect.
depleted, like I could see athletes, including maybe the person, staring back at you on the screen where, you might do that and not take in enough carb in the last hour or two of your ride. And then you're doing the sauna and you're in the bathtub and you think, okay, I'm not going to do the recovery shake, which you mentioned earlier, do your recovery
Mhm.
shake. So then you could see someone actually getting quite depleted all around, like both hydration, electrolyte, and like actual calories, carbohydrates, right? So you could actually very quickly, be
Yeah.
have a significant fatigue. And then as far as like an experimental intervention, you're also changing a lot of variables there. So to your point, like you're putting a coat on and your toque and you're going to ride on your trainer and turn off the fan, and it's like, but you're also not going to drink, you
Yeah.
know, so there's a lot of variables that you're changing all at once there. So it probably would be better, as you say, to don't over drink or add a ton more electrolyte or anything like that, but like keep it the same. and then add the toque and the whatever you're gonna, as far as the
Yeah.
overdosing or the heat.
Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind too is the other thing I always tell athletes is, use heat adaptation for a specific reason, but anytime you are hotter than you need to be, you are not recovering, right? So, okay, get that 1 hour or hour and a bit of heat stimulus, but don't think, oh, I got to keep my core temperature up the entire day, because that's also impairing your ability to adapt to the training. And in 2021, there was actually a really nice paper out, which gets back to my original point about wanting to not kind of impact the really super high quality training with heat stress at the same time. The study was looking at kind of your metabolic markers of training response, and it was looking at the combination of exercise and heat stress and exercise without heat stress. And what they found was that the group that had the exact same exercise but with the heat stress, their metabolic response was less than the group that was doing the exercise without any heat stress. So it really shows that the heat is an added stress to your body, right? So that's why you want to get it, in a sense, out of the way, get heat adapted as early as possible, and maintain rather than, again, this is my last 4 weeks to prep for this big event, I'm also going to get heat adapted also. That's probably the worst time, because you're not doing your physical training the best that it can be.
Now, okay, let me see if so the idea is that it sort of like was blunting the response, or
Yeah.
you just didn't get an additional response? What?
You're blunting the training
Oh,
response.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
By
Because you're like missing the anabolic window, or like what are we talking about? Is that sort of what you think?
Yeah, it was really looking at, PGC1 alpha, which is one of the main kind of markers of mitochondria kind of
Yeah.
growth.
So I think I understand the idea then with the so it's sort of like the body has like bigger problems, so it's not going to be like, yeah, let's keep working on making you a super athlete and move all this oxygen. Instead it's saying like, oh, I need to get myself cooled down, and like, so it's sort of, you might not get the other adaptations.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why, you want to use heat, but you want to do it, as efficiently as possible. And ideally, you're not kind of doing the really high quality training and the really kind of critical training at the same time.
We overuse the phrase big rocks, but yeah, it strikes me that you've touched on the nutrition piece and the hydration piece, and the actual training you're supposed to be doing, the intensity, the long rides. You don't want to, sit at home in your sauna, trying to get the 1% heat adaptation gain and miss, good food, good training, practicing your actual sport, sort of those things. So that makes a lot of sense. I had one other, we can call it a hack, but let me tell you about this thing. So I'm in the tub. Don't picture it, but I'm in the tub. And so then I get out and I'm like, okay, 20 minutes. Oh. But then I was like, what if you overdress then? You're very hot. You're like sweating when you get out of the tub. So then I put on a toque and like wool socks and sweatpants and a shirt. And then I can walk around the house, but I'm sweating vigorously from my face. So would you say that potentially could prolong, say I was short, say I only got, I finished my ride, it was a bit hot, and then I got into the hot tub for 20, 30 minutes. Then if I could prolong it, and again, I'm tracking heart rate, so heart rate's up like 130, 140 beats, which is steady endurance for me. What do you think? Does that sound like there's something there, or is that too weird and I shouldn't be sweating in track pants in my home?
I'm doing my best not to picture it first off, but I would also say that's probably a little bit of overkill.
Okay.
Keep in mind that temperature is not kind of on off, right? If your body temperature is up high, it's not as if the second you get out of the tub, it's instantly going to drop.
No, I can tell you it does not.
Exactly. So it's going to stay high for a while. So whether you put on kind of extra clothes or not to maintain it, you're kind of prolonging that window.
I guess what I was thinking is, say I didn't overdress on the ride, like I just did my ride, but then I was like 20, 30 minutes in the tub afterwards. So then I was a bit warm, but then I got, up into, then my core temperature actually got raised in the tub.
Mhm.
Is it worth prolonging it to get towards the 60 in that case, do you think?
Yeah.
Or leave it at the 30 and that's probably enough for an old
In
masters guy?
in that specific case where you don't think you got kind of in a sense hot enough and you want to kind of prolong the duration, then yeah, I mean, try it. I don't
Mm,
think it's something you need to do
okay.
all the time. I think you can be much more effective with just the training, and then again, if you're going to supplement it with
Mm,
a passive heat load afterwards. I think where you can end up going is really what we were just talking about, where you just are starting to now mess with your recovery,
mhm.
right? You're just now thinking, oh, again, maybe I can stretch it in an hour, maybe I can stretch it 2 hours. And
Right.
yeah, maybe your core temperature is up, but it's also at the detriment to your recovery. So
Gotcha.
that's why I say, like, you want to be hot when you're hot. When you don't need to be hot and you should be recovering, you should be recovering, right?
Okay.
So that's not the time also to,
So you're giving
oh,
that like a C rating as far as interventions that you might try.
yeah.
You can name it after me if it gets big. Let me know. Okay, so you've knocked off a lot of these things. We talked about we critiqued my protocol there. That was good. Um, so what I'm wondering here, the review study is really great, and it's the language is quite approachable, I think, for people if they wanted to spend the time and learn about, where has the research been, where has it come, and then sort of these different aspects, what counts as heat in adaptation, all these different definitions we've talked about.
And it's also, by the way, it is like, feel free to have it up
Oh,
on
okay.
site or a link to it. The final kind of summary has some really good kind of take home practical kind of points for everyone
Mhm.
that I think all readers, all kind of masters athletes can get something out of too.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it talks a little bit about, sort of progressing. I guess that's maybe the last thing we can talk about is after telling you about my track pants and trying to extend this, most cyclists are a little kooky. If you're thinking about this, you're a little kooky. More is always better. So I'm wondering, is there, if we were going to standardize this with, say a hot tub, and there's, we have our hot tub water and we have a duration, maybe we have a heart rate strap. If we were going to ease into this again as like a normal master's person, we're going to do it post training. Would you say like it's sort of like standardize the time, like, 15 minutes at maybe 102 degrees, and then, sort of ramp up the time or the temperature? What do you think's a best practice just to avoid going to like immediately I'm going to beat the world record for like sauna time or something?
Yeah, I don't think you'd really need to progress the heat of that, whether it's a sauna or the hot tub. Yeah, you might, if you find it really uncomfortable, you might start with 10 minutes or 15 minutes and build up to 30. But I don't think you need to vary the kind of temperature of the
Okay.
water or the
And usually
sauna.
that's around 40 is what they say. So you're
Yep.
saying you just put it at 40 and then get in, but start off with a duration that you're just moderately uncomfortable.
Yep. And I think the more important thing is, again, like, how do you monitor kind of yourself, let's say during exercise, to know that you are kind of, again, exercising hard enough and getting yourself hot enough to get a benefit. And keep in mind that, as you heat adapt, your heart rate is going to get lower. So you should be basing it on kind of your let's say you're going to be riding indoors as your main form of kind of heat stress. Well, you should be really basing it on your heart rate. So you want to, let's say your endurance heart rate is 140 beats per minute, and you want to be basing your wattage on heart rate rather than just saying I'm going to ride at 150 watts on day 1 all the way through day 10, because you're going to be heat adapted in day 10, and that 150 watts is going to be a lot easier. And it's also, you're not going to get the same thermal stimulus at day 10. That's why you want to base things on heart rate instead. You want to ride at, again, I know endurance heart rate is 140, and I want to peg it to that instead and let the wattage rise over the course of time. And the other way you can do it is just, again, really perceived effort, right? Day one should feel, in a sense, effort wise, just as hard as day 10. Day 10 should not be easier than day one, so to speak, in terms of how it feels.
Okay.
Right. So perceived effort is one way. Heart rate is another easy way to kind of track and kind of increase your heat stimulus over time.
Okay. So in that setting, you'd be increasing the wattage. You wouldn't necessarily increase, again, you said you'd keep the temperature. So in this setting of riding indoors, would you keep the ambient temperature about the same, and you wouldn't start adding clothing or something like that to, and keep the power the same?
I guess whatever you're doing, right? I mean, you might be indoors, and riding with more clothing than normal. I'm just saying, just keep that as is, but peg your heat workouts to heart rate instead. So day one, for example, have your efforts at 140 beats per minute. Day 10, it should also be 140. The wattage is going to be higher on day 10, but that's completely fine because your body is getting better at shedding heat. So it's going to need the harder stimulus to drive up temperature.
Gotcha. And so in this way, the heart rate is limiting us and sort of safeguarding us, which I think is, again, as people who are a little kooky who do things like this probably need some safeguards. So
absolutely.
I like that. Okay, well, that's great. I think we've covered a lot. I think probably maybe too much for some people, but for a lot of other people, I think will be really into this, which will be great. I know I'm really into it and thankful for your time and knowledge here today. We will link to the review study from 2023 there, the effects of heat adaptation on physiology, perception, and exercise performance in the heat, and updated meta-analysis. We'll link to, of course, to your Twitter or X. You're still doing that, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Not overly active, but still there.
Okay. Cool. And we have a few other links from our past episode, which we'll also link to as well, which talks about trainer riding and optimizing maybe for Zwift racing or something like that. It was more on the other side of things. Cool. Anything else we can link to or share?
I think those are the main things. And it's amazing how much environment affects you. We'll spend another episode maybe talking about exercise in the cold because Phil Wallace, his master's was on that, psychology and exercise in the heat. He just finished his PhD last year, and it was we did some really challenging hypothermia and exercise studies. So we can talk about that when it gets to be winter.
Okay, that sounds great. That sounds like a date. It's definitely something I try and avoid. So maybe I can get adapted to it and improve my performance in the cold rather than just trying to escape it by going to sunny places. Cool. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. You're very welcome.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.